Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at a new FPGA handheld. It is called the Game Bub. And this one's a little bit different than the other FPGA handhelds we've already seen, including the Analogue Pocket, as well as the funny playing GBC. This one is horizontal and then also is focused on Game Boy Advance. And this is the project put together by just one person, and they are currently crowdfunding it. And this is a prototype that they sent over for me to test out and then send back. I've been messing around with this for about a week, and it's honestly exceeded my expectations from a one-man project. The game accuracy on this is pitch perfect. It has a bunch of additional features, including a cartridge reader and cartridge dumper, and it also is surprisingly comfortable to use. When you combine that with an operating system that just works and is very intuitive, it's actually been a very excellent experience for me. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to using FPGA over software emulation. We'll talk about that a little bit in this video, but when it comes down to it, if you're a huge fan of Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, and potentially some other systems down the line, then this might be worth paying attention to. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, to start, this is not going to be a review of the Game Bub. After all, this is a prototype and it's still in early stages of production. In fact, up until this campaign launched a couple weeks back, it was actually promoted as being a vertically oriented handheld, but then once the campaign launched, they had all this new information, and yes, it is now horizontal. And so I'm not going to judge some of these things too harshly because, they're still a work in progress. The D-pad and face buttons are 3D printed, the screen is not OCA laminated just yet, and so on. Now, before we jump into the specs, let's do a quick primer on FPGA versus emulation. Now, I'm no expert in any of this, but the way I see it, FPGA, which stands for Field Programmable Gate Array, is essentially hardware replication at the circuit level. So they use these special chips called FPGA chips that will replicate that experience at a much lower base level to essentially mimic the original chips that were used in old hardware. The advantage of FPGA is that it behaves like that original hardware, which means things like latency are almost identical between the two. Meanwhile, software emulation is using code to mimic the overall environment in which you played those games, which increases the latency and also is not quite as accurate. And so the reason why people love FPGA is because it looks and feels like the original console and even sounds like it too, again because at the circuit level it is essentially behaving the same way as the original hardware. And so the Game Bub, much like the Analogue Pocket, is a much more accurate representation of the original gameplay compared to something like a retro handheld, the more common things that I cover in this channel. So let's talk about the specs, and we'll start with the FPGA itself, which is that chip. And I'm not going to read this one back because I don't know how to pronounce this, but this is the FPGA they are using. One of the more important aspects of an FPGA is how many logic elements or logic cells that it has. And this FPGA has 101,000 logic cells. By comparison, the Analogue Pocket has two different FPGAs. One of them is around 50,000 and the other one is around 15,000. So altogether, this is a much more powerful processor than you would find in the Analogue Pocket. And these numbers do have wider implications. For example, the Mister, which is a popular FPGA console, which kind of kick-started this whole FPGA gaming thing, it has 110,000 logic cells, so very similar to this handheld. And the Mister's got enough power to run some more advanced cores like PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64, as well as Sega Saturn. And that's one of the more exciting things about the Game Bub is it's got a lot of headroom and a lot of potential. For example, the Game Boy Advance core, which this is running, only takes up about a third of its overall logic core. So there is a lot of room to work with. So there's a potential, if other people wanted to develop cores for this handheld, that they would be able to play some of those more advanced systems. And to top it off, the Game Bub is 100% open source. You can go on their GitHub right now and build this thing if you would like using their schematics. It would be super advanced, but that's one of the great things about it is that it's completely open and available for other people to develop on. Back to the specs here. So the display is 4 inches with a resolution of 720 by 480. That makes it a perfect 3x integer scale when it comes to Game Boy Advance, and it has that same 3:2 aspect ratio. The screen itself is an IPS LCD, and of note, The test unit that I'm working with here today is not OCA laminated. That means there's a little bit of a gap between the glass on the front as well as the display underneath, much like how it was back in the day. But they do plan on having the screens OCA laminated at the time of actual release. The battery is 3000 milliamp hours and they're predicting about 14 hours of battery life, and that's about right when it comes to what I've seen so far. I only charged it once in all of my testing over this past week, and even then it was really just a test to make sure that it charged properly. This thing has hours and hours of battery life. And it's going to weigh about 250 grams or a little bit under 9 ounces. As far as connectivity, this does have 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth, but they are not activated in the device just yet, just because the cores that are already enabled in it do not have any sort of functionality for them. But it is cool that they actually built it into the board itself so you can use it for other cores in the future. The back has a cart reader, which allows you to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games, including flash carts, but it also has a microSD card slot, and you can load your ROMs directly from there. So it is kind of the best of both worlds in that you can play your original hardware as well as use a microSD card to load up ROMs if you'd like. Of note, the cartridge reader can also dump your games into a ROM file and put them directly on the microSD card. So if you don't want to add wear and tear to your original cartridges, you can actually just dump them right onto the machine itself. And finally, it's got basically all the features you would expect from a Game Boy Advance. It's got a link cable connection, it has a real-time clock and rumble and gyro, and an accelerometer. The handheld itself is currently in the funding stage over at Crowd Supply, and it's been going for about a 2-week period at this point, and it has about a month to go as of making this video. Their goal is to get 300 backers, and so far they're a little bit over a third of the way there. The devices are going to be manufactured by a company called Soldered Electronics based out of Croatia, and they're expecting to ship them sometime in early 2026. Right now they're projecting February. As far as pricing, this device is not cheap, but a lot of this really comes down to the FPGA itself. I've read that it cost about $150 for the chip alone. And the pre-order price is going to be $250 for the standard transparent model, and then $299 plus shipping for the transparent purple option. They're also offering a $60 dock if you want to connect this to your wireless controllers and to a TV or monitor. And so that's what we're looking at with the Game Bub. This is an expensive handheld with a very powerful FPGA inside, but you're going to pay for it. It's $250 starting price compared to the Analogue Pocket, which starts at $220 before shipping, but doesn't have as many logic elements as the Game Bub itself. So let's start by talking about the handheld itself, and before we even talk about the controls and whatnot, let's talk about the bezels on this display because they are quite large. The developer is aware of the fact that they are pretty big and unsightly, but there are a couple issues there. Number one is that apparently they had a hard time finding something within the supply chain, but then also they needed something that was quite tall to be able to accommodate an entire Game Boy cartridge behind it. And so even though, yes, we do have these large bezels, it all does kind of line up when it comes to adding a Game Boy or Game Boy Color cartridge. Everything is nice and flush. Another advantage of the larger screen is that it makes it for a larger size altogether, so it's a very comfortable handheld to hold. My first impression was that the acrylic shell gives it a very homemade sort of look, which I don't think is a bad thing. Like, you can read the PCB right here and see the date on it and everything, but it does have a kind of slick feel altogether. Now, this is not the final acrylic shell, but just based on the images that I've seen, I don't think it's going to get like a frosted shell to it or anything else like that. And so right off the bat, my number one impression is that yes, this does feel quite homemade, which makes sense. You know, this is an open source project. The front of the device is very intuitive. We've got our D-pad and face buttons, our menu button right here, and then select and start buttons. We've also got 2 stereo 1-watt speakers. We will test them in a moment. Up top, we've got shoulder buttons, a micro SD card slot, some pin header connections, a power button, volume up and down, and then of course our cartridge reader. On the bottom, we've got our headphone jack as well as a link cable connection, and then our USB-C port for charging. This can also be used for USB-C connection with your computer. And then finally on the back, we don't really have anything other than, you know, the 2 batteries, which are separated here, and then of course our cartridge slot, which we already saw. And the cartridge slot will also fit Game Boy Advance cartridges, and that's what it's going to look like. Now the buttons here are all 3D printed, so I'm not going to judge them too much, but one thing I did note is that the D-pad on this does feel rather small considering the size of the overall handheld. It's about 18 millimeters in overall length, which I was surprised to find is actually larger than some D-pads that you might be familiar with. It's about half a millimeter larger than the original Game Boy Advance, and about a full millimeter larger than the Game Boy Micro. And it's also just a hair larger than the Game Boy Advance SP. Same thing with the Nintendo 3DS, this one also has a surprisingly small D-pad. And the Game Bub's D-pad is smaller than other handhelds like the PS Vita as well as the Retroid Pocket 5. So all things considered, yes, it is a small D-pad, especially considering the overall size of the handheld, and they obviously have more room to work with, but I think that just in practice, it's actually been pretty good. It feels like a cross between a dome switch and a rubber membrane. It has a fair amount of travel to it, but it is also nice and clicky. Now, this is 3D printed, so I don't want to judge it based on it right now, but overall, it feels pretty good, kind of like a cross between the original Game Boy Advance and the Game Boy Advance SP. So there was never a moment in all my gameplay testing where I felt like, oh, the D-pad needs to be fixed, other than the fact that it definitely doesn't feel final. Next, we have that menu button. So the way this works, if you're in the middle of a game, you can just press on that and it'll allow you to resume or reset your cartridge or just go right back to the main menu. And it works almost instantly. It is crazy how fast the operating system works on this. On the right, we've got our face buttons. These have the same sort of soft clickiness as the D-pad. Again, they feel very good and very similar to a Game Boy Advance SP, but with a little bit more travel. These are also 3D printed, so I'm not sure if these are going to change in the future, but I expect they will. We've also got our start and select buttons down here. Let's talk about these shoulder buttons. So these are 3D printed, so not the final model, but they do feel pretty good. They have a micro switch connection. You can see them actually making the connection right there, but they are soft and not too clicky. So I like the fact that they are easy to press down on. Given the fact that we may be able to expand the functionality of this device to include things like PlayStation 2 cores, it would have been nice to have L2 and R2 buttons up here as well, but I understand that as a Game Boy Advance focused handheld that they didn't go that extra mile. When it comes down to it, I am pleasantly surprised by these overall controls because I was expecting it to be pretty janky, a small project like this, but they actually got everything pretty much nailed down. Like the buttons feel really good, the face buttons and the D-pad. The ergonomics on this are not half bad either. There's plenty of space for all of my fingers, and even though it does kind of drop off here at a 90-degree angle, it's still kind of rounded, and so I've never felt anything like sharp as I'm playing it, so it's been an overall comfortable experience. I think the overall size is also pretty reasonable. It's very similar to the Anbernic RG477M. Now, obviously the screens are completely different between the two, but I do like the fact that it's about equal in terms of size. I'm not sure if I would go as far as calling it pocketable in the sense that it is rather large once you have it in your pocket, but it is certainly portable, something I could throw in a backpack, no problem whatsoever. So I think hardware size, it's a pretty impressive package considering the fact that this is not made by a large company or anything. It really is the design of one person that is being helped by a manufacturing team. To put it another way, I think it could be refined more. I think the bezels could be smaller. I think that the plastic feel overall is a little bit slick, but I have been surprised at how much I've enjoyed my gameplay time over the past week. Now let's talk about the software or operating system experience, and it is dead simple. Number one, you can just run cartridges on it. So you can throw in your Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance cartridge, even ROM hack cartridges like I'm using here, and flash cards. All of them are going to work fine. From there, it's just a matter of selecting Run Cartridge and it boots right up. And you have the ability to bypass the GBA logo if you'd like, or you can see it too. Once you're in the game, you can tap on the menu button to bring up this dialog, which we already talked about, or you can also press the menu button and then volume up and down to increase and decrease the brightness. The screen itself does get impressively bright. This is at full brightness right here, but it also gets nice and dim too. So depending on how you're going to be playing it, I think it's actually going to be a pretty darn good fit. In addition, when you're in a game, you can tap on the power button. This will give you the ability to reboot the console itself or just power it down right here. And really, that's about it when it comes to playing your cartridge games. So if you're just looking to have a very simple experience, it's all very intuitive if you ask me. Now, in addition to running cartridges, you can also load ROM files. This is also super simple. So you just put them on the microSD card, hit load ROM, and then you navigate to them within your file system. From there, you can just choose your game and then launch it. The boot up time on this is a little bit slower, but honestly still pretty quick. Now, these FPGA cores were built from the ground up by this developer, which is really impressive, but they're not going to have the same functionality that you may be expecting from software emulation. So for example, this doesn't have the ability to use save states or to fast forward or rewind, some of the other functionalities that you may be used to with a software handheld. However, in the settings, there are a couple tweaks that we can do. So for example, we can change out the date and time here. We're using the real-time clock. We can also adjust the rumble strength. And then also within each individual core, we've got some settings too. This is all a work in progress, so it's not final, but you can enable DMG mode. That's going to give you that green look when playing Game Boy games, or you can turn it off if you're going to be playing Game Boy Color. You can also skip the boot animation. That's going to be your boot logo. And then finally, you can also change your color correction options. We've got a few options, including just turning it off, but you also have Game Boy Color correction, and then the Game Boy Advance color correction. So this will be like playing a Game Boy Color game on a Game Boy Advance. Same thing with the GBASP, these each have their own different profile. Personally, I've just been using the GBC color correction, so it's going to mute the colors a little bit, but I still think it looks very nice. We've also got other DMG color options, including grayscale, the regular green, which I've been using, and then also Game Boy Pocket. And Game Boy Advance has other options too, including skipping the boot animation, and then also you have other color correction options too. You have none, Game Boy Advance SP, Nintendo DS. So for example, the original DS allowed you to plug in those cartridges. Same thing with the DS Lite. And then we have Nintendo Switch Online Game Boy Color correction too. I've just been using the regular Game Boy Advance one, but I love the fact that we have these other color profiles if you want them. And then also they have the ability to use the Game Boy Player functionality, which I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think that's the GameCube adapter, so it's going to mimic that. And then finally down here we have the tools section. So this is still also a work in progress, but you can see some of these options that you can mount your SD card over USB. That means that you can plug this in directly into your PC and then load your games onto the micro SD card without having to take them out of the console. Another thing that's not working just yet is the cartridge backup and restore. So the idea here is that you can dump your cartridge from the cart itself into your micro SD card as a ROM, so you can preserve this if you would like. They've got a demo of it on their website, and it looks like you're going to be able to back up your ROMs and save files, and then also write them onto cartridges too. Okay, let's start with some tests. We'll start with audio. So this is just going to be playing Golden Sun here during a battle. And to my ear, this sounds awesome. I love the fact that it's in stereo as well. Now, another thing I wanted to test in this video is the overall timings. Now, there is a whole breakdown on their website talking about how they got the timings that they did and how accurate it really is. But I also wanted to test it myself using some rudimentary tools, which includes just using my camera. So what I did here is I ran a time trial in Mario Kart Super Circuit, and on the top right, I'm using an original Game Boy Advance. On the top left, I'm using the Anbernic RG34XX. This is a software emulation handheld. And then down below, I've got the Game Bub itself. I tried my best to start all these games at the exact same time, and then I let it run for a full 10 minutes, which is when the counter stops working. And even after a few minutes, I could see that the software emulation was not quite keeping up. If I pause it and zoom in right now, you can see that there's about a 3-second difference between the Anbernic and the other two, and the other two are almost identical. It's hard to capture them perfectly, but if I pause it again at a different angle, you can see that there's a few hundredths of a second difference between the two, and it looks like the Game Bub is just a tiny bit faster. Now bear in mind, this is after 9 minutes and 16 seconds of gameplay time. We're talking hundredths of a second over this period. By contrast, the Anbernic is almost a full 3 seconds ahead of the other. So yes, I would say that this is a very accurate core. I also ran the same test between the Game Bub and the Analogue Pocket, and same thing here where it's almost identical between the two. And so in terms of timing and accuracy, this looks to be very, very close to original hardware, maybe off by a couple hundredths of a second after 10 minutes of gameplay, which again, I'm not sure is perceivable with the human eye. If you want to read more about how they got there and some of the tools that they used, I would recommend checking out their crowdfunding page and looking at their updates. That's where you can read more about this. Now let's do a quick screen comparison between the Game Bub and the Analogue Pocket. The Analogue Pocket is a 10x integer scale of the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. It's also 3.5 inches. When playing these same games on the Game Bub, it's going to shrink it to a 3x integer scale, which means the image is going to be smaller, about 2.8 inches altogether. So I think that just in terms of overall playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, the Analogue Pocket seems to be a better fit. It's vertically oriented, so it just kind of makes a lot more logical sense to play these types of games on this handheld. And then also this screen has got a higher resolution and then also is going to be bigger. The Analog Cores has a lot more colorization options to it, including the ability to use like an LCD grid overlay, and so I do feel like this is going to be a more authentic experience, but it's also nice that you can play these games on the Game Bub. But when it comes to Game Boy Advance, this is where the Game Bub really shines. We've got only about 3.1 inches when playing GBA on the Analogue Pocket versus a full 4 inches. The Game Boy Advance core, especially within the open FPGA system, doesn't have as many color correction options either, and so I do think that the overall look and feel of the Game Bub is superior. It's also worth noting that the Analogue Pocket bezels are not thin either. These are pretty chunky. In fact, it makes me feel a little bit better about the big bezels on the Game Bub when I compare them side by side. So I think overall, when it comes to playing Game Boy Advance games, I've had a really great time testing the Game Bub. I love the fact that we have color correction options to make it look and feel a bit more like an original Game Boy Advance console, but of course it's a backlit LCD at a 3x resolution upscale. The 4-inch display is also very impressive. It's a really fun way of playing Game Boy Advance games, especially if you are more accuracy-minded. I also love the fact that we've got many different ways to play our games without having to do any sort of workaround. We can launch the cartridge itself, or we can dump our ROMs onto a microSD card, play them from there, but then we can also play like ROM hack carts as well, including Pokemon Unbound, which I'm doing right here. And I think that's probably one of the big strengths of the Game Bub is that you can come at it from different angles. If you're a preservationist and you want to make sure you're playing your original cartridges, or you want to dump them, you can do that directly on the device, play them from your microSD card. Or if you just want to play ROMs and ROM hacks, you can do that as well. Now, when it comes to playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color, this is a bit of a degraded experience if you ask me, just because it really makes those bezels stand out. The games are going to naturally shrink down to a 3x integer scale, which makes the overall borders around it even more massive, but then it's also just not a more natural fit when playing it on a horizontal handheld compared to something vertical like the Analogue Pocket or the funny playing GBC. I do love the fact that we have color correction options and that this is just a core that we can play on this device in the first place, but I do think it is primarily something that most people will be playing Game Boy Advance on. Now, the developer also loaned me a prototype of their dock, so we could check this out too. This is 3D printed, so not final, but you can see that, yeah, it's just a standard USB-C dock, and it has the ability to, plug it in here to power and charge the device. And you can also use HDMI and then 2 USB ports to be able to plug in controllers. And for my setup, I use the 8BitDo Ultimate controller, which is the Bluetooth version, but it has a 2.4 gigahertz dongle. So I pushed it over into 2.4 gigahertz mode, plugged this in, and it controlled instantly. From there, I was able to navigate through the menu, pick up my game, and then start it right up. I'm assuming that at some point we will have Bluetooth connectivity options as well, but as it stands right now, a wireless dongle seemed to do the trick nicely. But one thing I did notice is the video output is in full screen when playing Game Boy Advance, so it's not showing 3:2 but 16:9. I saw the same thing with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games in that they basically stretched them out a little bit more because it was expecting to output this to a 3:2 display. And so this is an indication to me that maybe something needs to be done on the software side to allow for proper scaling on a 16:9 display, because as it stands right now, it seems to be just outputting and expecting it to be on a 3:2, but it should really accommodate that and have different black bars on the left and right. Now on the website, they do show a Game Boy Advance game playing in 3:2 on a 16:9 monitor, so it's probably something that just needs to be worked out in the software. If they get that fixed, I think that this will be a pretty excellent docked experience because it's all nice and snappy and you can navigate through everything using just the menu button on the controller itself. Okay, so putting this all together, let's wrap up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Game Bub as I've tested it so far. Number one is that it's fully open source. The hardware, the firmware, all of that is properly licensed and available for the public. I think it's a great step when it comes to video game preservation, but then also with collaboration to allow other people to develop other cores for this FPGA. And we've got a ton of headroom, which means that, FPGA development for other systems like Super Nintendo or maybe arcade games are all within the realm of possible. I also think the operating system here is very intuitive and it just works. I love the idea of just knowing exactly what I need to do to get in and out of my game. It's also a great experience when playing Game Boy Advance games. The screen is a perfect match, and that horizontal form factor is quite comfortable. It also has extreme accuracy with the original hardware to the point where I cannot notice a difference between the two. For me personally, I mostly do software emulation, but when I get my hands on original hardware or an FPGA console like this, it makes me feel like I'm in superhero mode because all of a sudden my character just moves exactly the way I want them to. I think I'm just so used to software emulation and the inherent latency that we have there that when I finally get my hands on something that feels like original hardware, it feels awesome. And that's definitely the experience I've had with the Game Bub. I also think the console has excellent battery life. I only had to charge it once throughout my week of testing, and I think that around 14 hours of gameplay time is a pretty accurate assessment. Now, of course, it's not perfect, and even though it's a prototype, I have a couple things I wanted to add. Number one, this console feels like a homemade handheld. This can be a good or bad thing depending on the vibe that you're looking for. I think it's awesome that we have a product like this, that we have something built from the ground up, and it makes me a little bit more forgiving about some of its quirks. But if you're looking for something that gives you a bit more of a taken care of experience, then I don't think the Game Bub is going to be a very good fit. Another thing that we are kind of not used to in this modern day and age is really big bezels on a handheld, and this thing does have pretty chunky bezels. When I'm playing Game Boy Advance, I just kind of stop noticing it as I'm in the middle of a game, but when it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color, it's a lot more apparent. And a lot of this really comes down to personal preference. After all, the Analogue Pocket itself also has large bezels. One other thing to bear in mind is that it's a somewhat risky endeavor, all things considered. After all, this is all crowd-funded right now, and it hasn't hit its target goal. But it is also worth noting that if this doesn't meet its goal, then you're not going to be charged. Basically, you're putting a pledge in now, but you're only going to get charged if it actually succeeds. Either way, it is worth noting that, crowdfunding has its own set of issues, including delays and whatnot, as, world events and supply chain issues come about. And then also bear in mind that this is a pricey handheld, but I think understandably so, given the fact that the FPGA itself costs about $150 on its own. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that there are much cheaper ways to play Game Boy Advance. You can even buy a modded original console for around like $150, so you can save money that way as well and still get it, backlit and all the other things that you may want. Not to mention the fact that if you're okay with software emulation, you can play Game Boy Advance games on a handheld that costs about, $30 and still going to give you a pretty good experience. So I don't think the Game Bub is for everybody. I think it's really for FPGA enthusiasts and those who really love the Game Boy Advance and the potential of a handheld like this that is fully open source. For my part, I am excited enough about the Game Bub that I am going to pledge for it. Now, I've got a million ways to play Game Boy Advance, but I just love the potential of this machine and the fact that it's just one person's vision that is now coming to life. It also helps that we've got some excellent controls, a nice screen, and a lot of processing power to potentially be able to play other systems in the future. So I'm kind of seeing this as an investment device. I think it's going to be even better a year or two from now. It kind of reminds me of the Analogue Pocket. When I first picked one of these up a few years ago, it could only play cartridges and then Game Boy Studio games, and that was it. It wasn't until later that we got the open FPGA system and the ability to load a bunch of games from the SD card and additional systems. So the Analogue Pocket became better and better over time, and I'm hoping that the Game Bub will do something very similar. I would love to have something like this to be able to play FPGA games like Super Nintendo with this horizontal form factor. That'll be great. Maybe even something like PS1. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. It's a really exciting prospect, but I can totally understand why something like a regular old retro handheld might be a better fit. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.